What would you order if it were your last meal on Earth? In Florida's death row, that question isn't hypothetical. It's the final reality for some of the state's most notorious criminals. From heartfelt apologies to bone-chilling wishes, their last moments are as haunting as their crimes. But one inmate's final words would leave you stunned. John Spankalink. Florida's death chamber sat in silence for 15 years, until John Spankalink was strapped into the electric chair. A drifter with a criminal history and a loaded gun, Spankalink picked up a fellow hitchhiker in California and traveled east. What followed in that Tallahassee motel room was brutal. He shot the man in the back and bludgeoned him with a hatchet. Spankalink claimed it was self-defense. The court called it cold-blooded murder. He refused his last meal, skipped the final comforts, and left behind a final message. Capital punishment means those without the capital get the punishment. The state called it justice. Others called it a political execution. Robert Austin Sullivan. Then came Robert Austin Sullivan, a man whose death sparked years of legal battles and public debate. Convicted of murdering a motel clerk in 1973 during what was claimed to be a robbery gone wrong, Sullivan maintained his innocence for over a decade. Witnesses denounced, doubts piled up, but the state moved forward. On the day of his execution, he declined the traditional last meal and instead received communion. He spoke no final words, just silence, heavy with the weight of what some called blatant injustice. Arthur Frederick Goode III. But the most disturbing of all was Arthur Frederick Goode. There was no mystery in his case, only horror. A twisted predator with a long history of mental illness, Goode kidnapped, essayed, and murdered young boys. His crimes were unspeakable, but his behavior on death row would give everyone chills. Goode sent letters to one of his victim's younger brothers, calling him cute. He showed no remorse. His last meal was a mix of steak, milk, and ice cream, childish, almost taunting. Not only did he use his final meal as a metaphor for his mental illness, he seriously requested intercourse with a young boy one last time. And just before the switch was flipped, he looked into the crowd and told a reporter, "Tell people I'm a good boy." James Dupree Henry. Then came James Dupree Henry, whose name became a symbol of rage and retaliation. In 1974, Henry broke into the home of Zellie L. Riley, a World War II veteran and police officer. When Riley interrupted the robbery, Henry beat him, stabbed him, and left him to die on his living room floor. The brutality shocked Orlando. Henry's execution in 1984 drew national attention, especially after civil rights leaders pleaded for clemency, arguing racism had tainted the case. But Florida didn't flinch. As the chemicals surged through his veins, Henry's last words were a calm, defiant prayer. "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." The room went still. The debate roared on. Johnny Paul Witt. And then there was Johnny Paul Witt, a killer with a chilling history and a case that tore apart the jury system itself. At just 15 years old, he'd already been in psychiatric hospitals. By 17, he lured a younger boy into the woods, tortured him, and burned his body. The crime was monstrous. But Witt's case gave rise to Wainwright versus Witt, where a potential juror was dismissed simply for expressing doubts about the death penalty. The Supreme Court ruled it was justified, and then Witt's execution followed, swift and silent. Carol City Murders. It was supposed to be just another quiet night in Carol City. A house filled with the usual chaos of a big family, kids doing homework, someone watching TV, laughter echoing through the walls. But by morning, that same home had become a graveyard, one of the most horrifying crime scenes in Florida history. 6 people, 4 of them children, were dead. Each of them shot execution style, lined up in the bathroom like cattle for slaughter. Their bodies were found slumped in the tub and on the floor, their mouths duct-taped, their hands tied behind them. The youngest victim was just 10 years old. One child played dead under a corpse to survive. Another, critically wounded, lived to describe the massacre. And what he said changed everything. At first, no one could understand why anyone would carry out such a merciless, targeted killing. But as the investigation unraveled, the motive revealed itself like a trap door, swinging open beneath everyone's feet. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment killing. 15-year-old Cheryl Smith had dared to testify against a drug dealer in court. She was marked. But her entire family? They were collateral. Police rounded up suspects fast, but one name kept surfacing over and over: Marvin Francois. He wasn't just another thug on the street. Francois styled himself like a boss, slick and smug, always a step ahead. He had been a high-ranking enforcer in a drug trafficking ring, a man who knew how to make people disappear. The more detectives dug, the clearer it became. He wasn't just involved, he was in charge. Francois denied it all, claimed he was framed, but the survivors had seen his face. The evidence was airtight, and when the trial began, he didn't beg. He performed, cool, defiant, staring down the jury like he could talk his way out of murder. He couldn't. The verdict came swift: death. But the case didn't end there. What shocked everyone was that Francois had partners. Leonard Tony Coleman and David Thomas were also arrested in connection with the crime. But in a twist no one saw coming, their cases unraveled. Coleman was granted a retrial and avoided the death penalty. Thomas's role was debated in court for years. Francois was the only one sent to the chair. On May 29, 1985, Marvin Francois walked into Florida's death chamber like a man unfazed. His last meal was pure comfort: fried chicken, fries, collard greens, cornbread, and a slice of cake. As if his hands hadn't once held the gun that silenced a family. He quoted scripture before the switch was thrown, claiming he was at peace and that he was going home. But there was no peace in Carroll City. Not really. Not for the surviving children. And definitely not for the parents who buried their babies. David Funchess. David Funchess came back from Vietnam with medals on his chest and monsters in his dreams. A decorated Marine turned broken man, he returned home with a mind scarred by war and a body wired on survival mode. But what happened next wasn't just another case of a veteran struggling to adjust. It was a descent into darkness that ended in death for others. And eventually for him too. In 1974, Funchess shot and killed 2 Jacksonville store owners during a robbery. It was brutal, there's no denying that, but the tragedy runs deeper. Funchess had been diagnosed with severe PTSD, back when PTSD didn't even have a name. He hallucinated. He cried out in his sleep. None of it was presented in court. His defense never mentioned his mental health. To the jury, he was just another black man with a gun and a criminal record. By the time the state finally executed him in 1986, he had spent 12 years on death row, largely forgotten except by advocates who begged for lenience, pointing to his war record and psychological trauma. Their pleas were drowned out by the hum of the electric chair. The same country that sent him to war strapped him down and called it justice. His final meal was a solitary one: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. His last words were, "I'm sorry." Willie Darden. Then there was Willie Darden, a man whose case became synonymous with injustice. Darden was convicted of the murder of a store clerk during a robbery in 1973. But his case was clouded by doubts, shadowed by a sense of wrongful conviction. His entire defense rested on the idea that he wasn't even in the store at the time of the crime. And yet, Florida moved forward with his execution almost a decade later. The controversy surrounding his case didn't just end with his execution. It ignited debates over racial bias, the quality of legal representation, and the fairness of the justice system. Darden's last meal was humble: fried chicken, French fries, and a Coke. His final words: "I am innocent. I did not kill that man." Those words, spoken just moments before his death, would echo for years. For many, Darden's execution was a tragic testimony of a broken justice system. Ted Bundy. And then, of course, there's Ted Bundy, the name that haunts every corner of true crime lore. By the time Bundy made it to Florida's death row in 1979, his name was already infamous across the country. He had already confessed to more than 30 murders, but the full scope of his brutality was still chilling to comprehend. Bundy's charm, his ability to blend into any crowd, made him one of the most terrifying killers of all time. He preyed on young women, abducting, torturing, and murdering them with a coldness that defied belief. Each crime was more calculated, more brutal than the last. In Florida, Bundy's reign of terror came to an end after the horrific murders at the Chi Omega sorority house. The brutality of the attack, 2 women bludgeoned in their beds, one of them assaulted, left a scar on the state of Florida that never truly healed. Bundy's trial was a media circus, with him often trying to manipulate the system, trying to present himself as a victim of circumstances. But by the time his execution date rolled around in 1989, the country was exhausted by his games. On the night of January 24, 1989, Bundy faced his fate. His last meal was a simple one: a cup of coffee. His final words: "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." That was it. The man who had once been a master manipulator, a killer who had evaded capture for years, was now reduced to a shell of a man, calm, eerily composed. But as the lethal injection coursed through his veins, the world exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Bundy had taken so many lives, had evaded justice for so long, but now, finally, he was gone. Jesse Tefero. Jesse Tefero's execution in 1990 wasn't just another night at Florida's death chamber. It was a tragedy drowned in mystery, and for some, a miscarriage of justice that still burns. Tefero, convicted of the brutal murder of 2 police officers during a botched robbery in 1976, had spent years on death row claiming his innocence. His conviction seemed ironclad, yet his final moments were surrounded by controversy that no one could have predicted. Tefero's execution would become infamous, not just because of the crimes he was accused of, but because of the horrifyingly botched execution. The lethal injection, meant to be a quick end, became a gruesome sight for the spectators. Witnesses watched in horror as Tefero's head caught fire. Flames erupted from his scalp, a tragic error that no one could have foreseen. This was supposed to be a swift, orderly procedure. Instead, it became a horrifying scene that sent shockwaves through the world. Tefero's crime was horrible, but no one imagined his execution would go down in history for all the wrong reasons. His last words were chillingly calm, though. "I'm not guilty, but I forgive you," he said. In the end, many were left asking if justice had truly been served, or if the system had failed him in ways no one could have anticipated. Edward Dean Kennedy. Then there's Edward Dean Kennedy, whose name became synonymous with chaos. Kennedy's crime, the cold-blooded murder of a sheriff's deputy in 1984, was calculated and brutal. He gunned down the officer during a robbery gone terribly wrong. His execution wasn't as controversial as Tefero's, but it was tragic in its own right. Kennedy's final meal was simple: a cheeseburger and fries, but nothing could prepare the witnesses for the chilling final moments. Kennedy had been sitting on death row for nearly a decade, a man made heartless by his past and unrepentant about his future. Yet, when it was time to face his fate, His last words were almost a whisper. "I want to thank God for the blessing of this day." No anger, no fear, just a strange calm before the inevitable. Robert Dale Henderson. And then there's Robert Dale Henderson, a man whose life ended in a way that would forever haunt the criminal justice system. Henderson was convicted of the brutal murder of a woman and her children during a robbery in 1981. He had left them to die in a pool of blood, senselessly slaughtering innocent victims for nothing more than money. The crime was horrifying, but Henderson's life wasn't simple. Raised in a world of poverty and violence, he grew up believing the streets were the only place he'd ever belong. But the system had a different plan for him. By the time of his execution in 1995, Henderson had spent 14 years in prison, and his case had become yet another symbol of the brokenness of the death penalty system. On the night of his execution, Henderson asked for one last moment of clarity. He requested no special meal, no final comforts. He simply asked for peace. And in his final words, he didn't beg for mercy or show regret. He simply said, "I hope you all find peace." No one was sure what that meant. Was it an expression of remorse, or was it the final defense of a man who had never really believed he'd escape his fate? Bernard Bolender. Bernard Bolender's crime wasn't just another robbery gone wrong. It was also an act of sheer violence. In 1981, he and a partner robbed a pawn shop, murdering 2 people in cold blood. What made Bolender stand out, though, was how long he managed to escape the law. For 2 years, he lived free, constantly staying one step ahead of the police. But in 1983, the law finally caught up with him. When he was put on death row, he didn't show regret or fear. He knew his time was coming. His last meal was simple: steak, fries, and a Coke. And his final words were, "I want to apologize to the families of the victims." But many felt those words came too late to make a real difference. Jerry White. Jerry White, on the other hand, was a man whose crime haunted those who knew him. In 1981, White murdered 2 women during a robbery. His crime was brutal and senseless, but it wasn't just the murders that shocked people. It was his lack of understanding of what he had done. After being sentenced to death in 1982, White spent years on death row, never really facing the true weight of his actions. His final meal was a pizza and soda, and in his last moments he seemed distant from it all. His final words were, "I'm sorry to the families." But that didn't feel genuine. It was as if he never really understood the full extent of the precious lives he had taken. Pedro Medina. Pedro Medina committed a crime that left a deep scar. In 1985, Medina was involved in a brutal murder during a drug deal. After a heated argument, he shot and killed a man named Abel Rodriguez. The crime was cold and calculated, and it left the community in shock. Medina wasn't just a petty criminal. He had a vicious nature and seemed to show no mercy. The trial was quick, and it didn't take long for Medina to be sentenced to death. His actions were unforgivable in the eyes of many, but what really shocked people was the way Medina seemed unaffected by the whole thing. He showed no real remorse for the life he took, and that coldness only added to the horror of his crime. He spent over 10 years on death row, and when his execution day came, his final meal was fried chicken and fries. His last words were chilling. "I'm sorry, but I have no regrets." His lack of remorse was unsettling, leaving everyone who heard it wondering if a person could really feel nothing at all, even as death approached. Gerald Stano. Gerald Stano is a name that sends chills down the spine. He wasn't just a man who killed once, but a serial killer whose thirst for violence stretched across decades. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, Stano claimed the lives of at least 12 women, though some believe the number may have been much higher. His method was disturbingly simple. He would pick up vulnerable women, often hitchhikers, and strangle them, leaving their bodies hidden in desolate areas. But what made Stano even more chilling wasn't just his brutal acts, it was his ability to blend into society. For years, he evaded suspicion, leading a life that seemed normal on the surface. He was arrested only after a painstaking investigation in 1984, and during his trial, the full scale of his crimes came to light. Sentenced to death, Stano spent the next 11 years on death row. His execution was set for 1998, but before he was led to his fate, he was calm, almost detached from it all. His final meal? A simple last request for a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke. His last words? "I hope the families of my victims find peace." Many people doubted his sincerity, questioning whether he truly understood the suffering he caused. His words were cold and distant, like the man himself. When he was finally executed by lethal injection, it was clear that justice had been served, but Stano's haunting legacy still lingers. Judy Buenoano. Judy Buenoano, also known as the Black Widow, was a woman who led a life marked by manipulation and death. She was convicted of murdering her husband James by poisoning him with arsenic in 1971. But that wasn't the end of her killing spree. She also murdered her son Michael in a similar fashion and attempted to kill her boyfriend John Gentry by sabotaging his parachute in 1983, though he survived the attack. Her cunning and cruel nature were evident in how she made each death look like an accident, a trick that kept her out of prison for years. But her dark secret couldn't remain hidden forever. In 1984, she was arrested and charged with her husband's murder. During her trial, it became clear that she had killed not just for money, but for control. She was sentenced to death, and after 10 years on death row, Judy's fate was sealed. When her execution date finally arrived in 1998, her final meal was nothing special: salad, bread, and some tea. But what made her last moment so chilling was her cold demeanor. She didn't seem the least bit remorseful. Her last words were, "I hope you all find peace." For those who had followed her case, those words felt hollow. Judy's execution was the end of a woman who had manipulated and murdered without guilt, leaving behind a trail of victims whose lives she destroyed for her own selfish gain. Alan Lee Davis. Alan Lee Davis, a man whose crime was as brutal as it was heartless. In 1980, Tio Davis broke into the home of a woman named Sharon Hensley, stabbing her, her young daughter, and her baby to death. He killed them in a frenzied rage, leaving their bodies scattered in the house. Davis's crime was horrific, but what made it even worse was the way he showed no remorse. He confessed to the crime, but his lack of emotion was chilling. Davis was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to death. But what made his execution so controversial wasn't just the brutality of his crime. It was the way his execution was carried out. In 1999, when Davis was put to death by lethal injection, witnesses described a scene that was deeply unsettling. His execution was anything but peaceful. Davis struggled and gasped for breath, his body twitching uncontrollably as he died. His final meal was a simple request: a lobster tail, fried potatoes, and a soft drink. His final words, though, were, "I didn't do it, I didn't kill anyone." These words left many wondering, was he still denying the truth even at the end? Terry Melvin Sims. Terry Melvin Sims wasn't a man of many words, but his crime spoke volumes. In 1985, Sims was involved in a brutal robbery that escalated into a murder. After a failed attempt to steal from a store, Sims shot and killed a man named James Thomas, leaving the scene with nothing but death and chaos behind. It wasn't just the murder that shocked people, it was the fact that Sims had been involved in multiple violent crimes before, yet he always seemed to slip through the cracks. For years, Sims continued to live in the shadows, hiding his true nature behind a mask of calm. But justice finally caught up with him in 1987 when he was arrested for the murder. His trial was quick, and in 1989, Sims was sentenced to death. Over the next decade, he sat on death row, showing little emotion, almost as if he had accepted his fate long before it came. When the day of his execution came in 1995, Sims's final meal was simple: a hamburger and fries. As he sat in that small room, his eyes revealed no fear, only a strange acceptance. His last words? "I just want to apologize for what I did." Those words, spoken in a low voice, seemed like too little too late. His death was the end of a violent life, but the questions about his remorse lingered long after. Thomas Harrison Provenzano. Thomas Harrison Provenzano was a man who lived on the edge, constantly jumping between life and death. Provenzano's crime in 1978 wasn't just shocking, it was a cold and calculated act of murder. After a dispute with a fellow inmate, he killed a correctional officer, Officer Jesse Burkett, in an act of unprovoked violence. Provenzano had a long history of violence, but this particular murder would seal his fate. For years, Provenzano sat on death row, plotting and scheming, but it was clear that his time was running out. In 1995, after nearly 2 decades on death row, Provenzano was executed. He had spent years appealing his sentence, but in the end, there was no way to escape the consequences of his actions. Provenzano's final meal was a simple request: a piece of fried chicken, fries, and a Coke. But his last words? "I didn't do it." The statement was a final twist that left many baffled. After all the years of legal battles, after confessing to the crime, Provenzano still chose to deny responsibility, even as he faced death. Edward Castro. Then there's Edward Castro, a man whose crime seemed as chaotic as his life. In 1982, Castro's rage led him to a brutal murder. After a dispute with his girlfriend, he snapped, shooting and killing her in cold blood. It wasn't just the murder that was shocking, it was the fact that Castro had been known to be violent for years. This wasn't the first time he'd used a gun to settle his problems, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Castro was arrested and convicted, but his trial didn't last long. In 1984, he was sentenced to death. For years he sat on death row, but the time finally came for him to face the consequences of his actions. When he was executed in 1991, Castro showed no emotion, no regret, no fear. His final meal was a simple plate of spaghetti, meatballs, and a soda. His last words were short but striking: "I did it. I'm guilty." Aileen Wuornos. Aileen Wuornos was a woman who spent much of her life trapped in a cycle of abuse, neglect, and violence. Born in 1956, she was abandoned by her mother, raised by her grandparents, and assaulted in her youth. Her life spiraled into prostitution, and in 1989, she began murdering men she encountered while working as a worker on Florida's highways. Wuornos killed 7 men over the span of a year, claiming that each victim had attempted to assault her. The murders were brutal, with Wuornos often shooting her victims at point-blank range before taking their vehicles and belongings. In 1991, after being captured during a routine traffic stop, Wuornos was arrested and later convicted for the murder of Richard Mallory, a man she had killed in 1989. During her trial, it became clear that Wuornos's troubled past, including years of abuse and trauma, played a significant role in shaping her actions. Despite this, she was sentenced to death in 1992. Wuornos's time on death row was marked by outbursts, erratic behavior, and a public battle over her mental health. By 2002, after 11 years on death row, Wuornos was executed by lethal injection. Her final meal was a cup of coffee. In her last words, she stated, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie Big Mother Ship and all, I'll be back. Her execution was the end of a violent and tragic life, but her case raised important questions about the intersection of mental illness, trauma, and criminal responsibility. Paul Jennings Hill. Paul Jennings Hill, an anti-abortion extremist, committed a crime that was both politically charged and brutally violent. In 1994, Hill shot and killed Dr. John Britton, a physician who performed abortions, and his escort, James Barrett, outside a Florida abortion clinic. Hill, who had been a vocal opponent of abortion, later claimed that he had acted to protect the lives of unborn children, justifying the killings as acts of defensive violence. His arrest and subsequent trial brought his radical beliefs into the spotlight. Hill was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1995. Despite the nature of his crime, Hill remained steadfast in his beliefs, refusing to express remorse for the murders. Instead, he continued to argue that his actions were morally justified. Over the years, Hill became a symbol for those who supported violent actions against abortion providers. In 2003, after nearly a decade on death row, Hill was executed by lethal injection. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and tea. His last words were, "I am innocent. I am not guilty of murder." Even in the face of his execution, Hill never wavered in his stance, leaving behind a legacy marked by radical conviction and violence. His case ignited debates about the morality of vigilantism and the intersection of personal beliefs and violent actions. As we think about the lives of these prisoners and the choices that led them here, one question lingers. What does it truly mean to face the consequences of our actions? And can anyone really ever make up for the things they've done? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.